I'm looking through the room to, yes, please, we have someone there. Microphone.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Wuschitz. I'm an artist and I have a question for Ina Wagner. I wanted to ask you, I was studying here, did my PhD, and I never heard of you, but you literally quote every one of my heroes. And I just wonder, what is your bubble? Who are your allies, and who were you working with? Or were you alone at the TU doing this amazing work?
No, well, I left in I retired in 2011. Yeah, so that's quite a while ago, actually. And no, I had a fabulous group here. And the interesting thing is, I studied physics, and I was one of few women who did a doctorate in physics. And I don't want to tell the whole story how I then ended up here. I started very early writing about women and about women's work, and also women in science and technology. And so these authors in these modes of thinking have been with me for a long time. But I never considered myself as somebody who does women's studies. Yeah, but being retired, I always wanted to write a book about these experiences of many decades, and so I ended up doing it. And and it gets more and more present in my current work. And there are several women with whom I cooperate. I just want to mention one, a colleague and friend of mine from Canada, and Balka, with whom I've done a lot of work. So that's interesting that in the end, also, probably I also didn't want to be considered just in quote a feminist researcher, because that would have marginalized me, and I wouldn't have been taken as seriously. This is just my thoughts. Thank you.
Next question, and I want to commend the person who asked, was exemplary in its brevity. Please.
Thank you. Nestor Hebel, computer engineer and artist. I have a question for anybody who's interested in answering, specifically about randomness in early computer art and possible ways of interpreting and explaining its prevalence in this time period.
Right.
You mean, was the question like how important random processes were at the time?
Yes, and on why it was such a big focus for people who worked on with computer art.
Well, the thing about working with a computer was about optimization and about delegating decisions in the creative process on a lower level. You would turn into be a conceptual artist, and then the computer would take all this decision, and for that you would need random processes. And of course, one part of this greater vision was that we would be able to simulate potential futures or delegate decisions. And in theory, Max Spencer and others, they compared the role of pseudo-randomness to intuition, which is not exactly what it is. Another interesting discussion was about randomness and pseudo-randomness itself. There's this famous quote that algorithmically tries to create random numbers is in a state of sin, because you might always create these patterns. So there were also artists, for example, like somebody like Otto and Oscar Beckmann, who tried to work with real randomness, like with noise generators, to get away from this limited pseudo-randomness, which is calculated to use real randomness. I don't know if this answers.
Yeah, and I would just add to that I think there was, at least in France, there was like a kind of reaction happening to expressionistic art and the idea that art was about, emotions or the interior psyche or all of these things. And I think a lot of the artists were drawn to this kind of cleaner, more methodical process. And so randomness was a way, again, to kind of automatize, again, what Margit was saying, like almost something like intuition, but then removing it from the domain of the artist's decision-making and like externalizing it. And then in Molnar's case, she did kind of a combination of both using randomness and then also just like using her own aesthetic judgment, which I think was maybe a bit controversial if you were a really orthodox, like, I press run and I walk away kind of artist. She was very much still there, going back and forth and intervening. So.
And just one thing, it would be really interesting research to go deeper into that topic, because artists were then really trying different methods. So, for example, using Markov chains and creating probability matrices. So it was really about how can we design complex systems to control random events.
Sure. Any other questions? Yes, please.
Ms. Rosen, earlier you talked about misusing the computer, but maybe this question is also kind of relating to our other talks. I think I'm instantly thinking about hacking, which is actually rather than a phenomena, I think, from the 80s, I guess. But I think it sounds like some early hacking approaches. But maybe you have something to say about that. What do you think about this perspective?
I mean, the term of misuse was an implicit quotation of Friedrich Hitler, who was early on talking about the Missbrauch von Heeresgerät. For him, it was a key moment in the history of media, that technologies that were meant for being used in war, suddenly they would be used to create music, poetry, and other things. And this was referring to that you would use this against the grain, and maybe even also open the black box, of course. And one last remark, what I appreciate so much about this period, also about hacking, that people think a new product, a new device comes on the market, and you think it's used to solve specific problems, and that human beings don't just, like if it's a hammer, and that people would never, if they get a hammer, walk around, what else could I do with it besides hammering a nail? But this is exactly what humans do. We get new devices which were invented for specific problems, and we do something completely different with it and discover opportunities which were even not imagined by the engineers. And this freedom and also our unstoppable playfulness, I found, is something very comforting.
Yeah, and I think also in design, so design of IT artifacts, there is this idea that design is only completed in use. And the idea that when people appropriate a device, a system, they they start finding things that have not been imagined by designers themselves. So it's a pretty general idea, not just confined to doing artwork. And I think it's interesting. Of course, there's a debate: can you call appropriating a piece of software? Can you also call the act of appropriation design? Yeah, but it's an interesting approach.
And I just wanted to add one quick thing, which is that, just to go back to your original question, I think hacking since the 80s has been associated with kind of creativity, like a creative approach. And I was trying to find, I think it's Sherry Turkle who wrote about that in The Second Self, if you are curious. And she writes about the gendering of different ways of computing as well. It's really interesting.
Thank you.
I believe we have room for one more question.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Tova Bele. I'm a former demo scene artist and video game designer. I was wondering, it came up during the talk about Vera Molnar. She used the teamwork of the unpaid interns to program her art. How much in all of your experience does the vision precede the outcome, and how much is the vision actually influenced by the act of programming and the technology, like the aspect, the interplay?
Well, I can speak for Molnar's particular experience, where at least in the 70s, when she, didn't have the interns, it very much influenced, I forget what word you used, but the vision, like there was a vision, but it wasn't a predetermined outcome. It was I have a vague idea of where I want to go with this, but as I go along with it and as the program runs and I see the results, I'm going to stop it, change it, do it again. And that was a really big part of her process, like her way of working. But insofar as how that worked once she had more like collaborators later on, I'm not so sure. Because that kind of complicates this idea that I don't know, like I'm really interested in this kind of, what's the word? Like the time frame of like reacting to something. And I think that's what she was also interested in, was like the split second where you see something and you say, I like this, or I don't like this, or this is doing what I wanted to do, or this isn't doing what I wanted to do. And that's like a sort of intuition as well. But then, of course, once there's a team working, it kind of distributes that decision-making more. But it's a really interesting question.
What's the question? If the chosen computer language would influence the way you work?
How the process, how the relationship between the vision and the process, to what extent the process, the act of doing, influences the vision. I hope I understood that correctly.
Yeah, so I might say, I think the artists were very sensitive also to the influence of the tools that we're using. And that is also to say that, for example, Fortran, the software was invented for something totally different, and you would have to formulate your problem accordingly. If you would program an analog computer, you would have to formulate the problem again different. And so, for example, I come back to Oskar and Otto Beckmann. By the way, Oskar Beckmann studied here at the TU Wien. They, for example, because they didn't want to subject themselves to the regular languages of programming, they called it experimental informatics. And so they created their own hybrid hardware to have a tool which was closer to the way the artist expected a computer to work.